Sirens carved through the void as the research cutter Lumen drifted toward a silent graveyard of metal, and the narrator marked the moment fear became prophecy. Jace Arden said, "This field wasn't on any chart." Dr. Mirasalis said, "Because someone erased it." The wreckage turned like black snow, and the ship's hull shuddered under micro-impacts. Nova Reed said, "I can hear it in the static." A buried signal clawed through the comms, a voice both human and wrong. Rian Cole said, "It's a salvage claim. We should turn profit and burn out." Jace stared at an ancient crest on a fractured prow and tasted dust from a history he taught others to fear. The narrator felt the galaxy lean closer as the message resolved. The voice said, "Return the dead to their war, or join them." Captain Elias Ward said, "Station keeping, minimal thrust." The void breathed, and the Lumen answered with a tremor that felt like memory waking. The narrator traced the signal back to a forgotten registry, while fear sharpened every breath. Jace Arden said, "This crest is Precept Fleet, lost 2 centuries." Dr. Mirasalis said, "Their records vanished in the Amnesty Accords." Ryan Cole said, "We sell coordinates, or we get buried under lawsuits." Captain Elias Ward said, "We log everything and touch nothing." Nova Reed said, "The voice keeps repeating a return protocol." The wreckage glimmered like a frozen tide, and history flexed beneath the ice of secrecy. The narrator felt the balance tilt as a shape unfolded from shadow and pointed at the Lumen, as if the past itself had noticed. A corridor hummed with the old ship's heartbeat as the narrator weighed caution against need. Jace Arden said, "If we map the field, we learn why it was erased." Dr. Mirasalis said, "Truth is a weapon if we wield it cleanly." Nova Reed said, "The return protocol asks for an identifier we don't have." Rian Cole said, "Or a key we can fake." Captain Elias Ward said, "We will not forge ghosts." The Lumen's sensors licked across the darkness and drew a lattice of pale lines over bones of starcrap. The narrator felt the hush before a storm when one line bent around a sealed vault buried in the drift. The narrator watched courage wear the mask of ritual as suits locked and seals hissed. Jace Arden said, "We approach the vault with recorder drones only." Dr. Mirasalis said, "And with respect for the dead." Captain Elias Ward said, "Tether lines, short burns, no contact." Rian Cole said, 6 minutes, and we bail if anything twitches." Nova Reed said, "Telemetry clean, drift stable." The wreck field rotated like a cathedral of iron, and cold light anointed their helmets. The narrator counted the distance as a drone flared its beacon and cast the vault's sigil across the dark like a wound. As the drone threaded the iron maze, the narrator felt the signal rise like a tide against the hull. Jace Arden said, "Recorder, online." Dr. Mirasalis said, "If the Precept stored a ledger, it will indict the present." Rian Cole said, "Or make us rich beyond fear." Captain Elias Ward said, "Focus on survival." Nova Reed said, "The return protocol just added coordinates inside the vault." The drone's light stroked a panel of names carved into alloy, and dust rose like breath. The narrator understood the message's threat as the panel clicked, and the vault began to open from the inside. The narrator measured the vault's breath as ancient seals parted and exhaled cold dust that glittered like drowned stars. Jace Arden said, "Record everything and touch nothing." Dr. Mirasalis said, "These inscriptions reference the first Concord." Nova Reed said, "The return protocol just authenticated us." Ryan Cole said, "We didn't give it a key." Captain Elias Ward said, "Then something gave it ours." A sarcophagus of data crystals rose on antigrav rails, and the hull groaned as if remembering pain. The narrator heard the past align its aim. A secondary door cracked, revealing a mural of civilians marching into silence. Jace Arden said, "This wasn't a battle trophy." Dr. Mirasalis said, "It is a ledger of debt." The vault lights dimmed and the ship's heartbeat sped up. The narrator understood that history did not sleep here. It waited with open eyes. Back aboard the Lumen, the narrator followed threads of code as the crystals unfolded like glass flowers and bled timelines. Nova Reed said, "It's encrypting itself to our ship ID." Rian Cole said, "Which means we just married a ghost." Dr. Mirasala said, "These manifests list evacuation routes that never reached port." Captain Elias Ward said, "Transmit nothing until we verify." Jace Arden said, "Look at the author tags. The signatures belong to commanders erased from school books, and one name mirrored Jayce's oath history." The narrator felt a hinge turn on a buried door. An incoming hail lanced the silence with velvet authority. The voice said, "This is Director Voss. Prepare to yield your fine." Rian Cole said, "The Scavenger King wears a badge." The ship dimmed to black alert. The narrator tasted metal and consequence. The narrator framed the standoff as the Lumen faced a sleek authority corvette that wore law like armor and hunger like perfume. Director Adrian Voss said, "You are in violation of Concord salvage protocols." Captain Elias Ward said, "Your warrant is stale by 2 centuries. Jace Arden said, "We request scholarly custody under preservation clauses." Dr. Mirasolis said, "The data indicates state crimes against civilians." Ryan Cole said, "They want the ledger burned." Nova Reed whispered that the return protocol now tracked Voss's ship like a magnet seeking iron. The narrator watched the corvette angle its shields. Voss said, "I enforce peace by any cost." Jace Arden said, "Then cost must be counted." The void tightened like a noose, and both ships drifted into the shadow of the dead. The narrator felt the ledger open like a wound as Mira cross-linked manifests, and the names assembled into a procession. Dr. Mira Solis said, "These routes fed civilians into Precept engines." Jace Arden said, "Not evacuation, conscription of bodies for fuel." Nova Reed said, "The protocol wants a witness declaration." Captain Elias Ward said, "We record and broadcast if fired upon." Rian Cole said, "They'll scorch us, then call it mercy." The ship hummed with the sound of history becoming evidence. The narrator traced a final column labeled Redemption Time. Jace Arden said, "This is why they erased the fleet." The room shrank as the truth expanded. The narrator pressed a finger against time and left a mark. When the first warning shot grazed their shields, the narrator heard the stars ring like struck glass. Director Adrian Voss said, "Surrender the artifact or be boarded." Captain Elias Ward said, "Broadcasting under witness clause." Rian Cole said, "Here comes the hammer." Jace Arden said, "Mira, anchor the ledger to public relays." Dr. Mira Salas said, "Uploading redundancies to autonomous buoys." Nova Reed said, "Return protocol is aligning debris into a corridor." The wrecks shifted as if obeying a funeral conductor. The narrator counted heartbeats while the corridor opened like a throat. Jace Arden said, "We run the gauntlet." Captain Elias Ward said, "All ahead minimal. Pray the dead, forgive us." The void swallowed their fear and spat out a path. The narrator found the Lumen buried in the shadow of a hollowed asteroid, while the debris corridor sealed behind like closing teeth. Captain Elias Ward said, "Cold thrusters only, we vanish." Jace Arden said, "The ledger fragments are still sensing." Dr. Mira Solis said, "History will not forgive delay or error." Nova Reed said, "The return protocol is writing a route we didn't request." Rian Cole said, "Routes lead to buyers if you ask them right." The narrator watched patience thin to a wire as alarms slept, but distrust woke. A masked transmission threaded the static with a calm whisper and a hidden signature. The voice said, "Hold position and await my vector." Jace Arden said, "Whoever that is knows our burn." Captain Elias Ward said, "We answer on a tight leash." The narrator felt a storm coil in the quiet. The mask signal unfolded into a restrained silhouette, and the narrator named it Caution, given shape. The figure said, "Call me Lias Ether, and keep your engines dark." Dr. Mirasalis said, "Why help us?" Liss Ether said, because truth is heavier than any fleet. Jace Arden said, identify your stake. Liss Ether said, the return protocol is not a beacon. It is a witness engine. Nova Reed said, it is binding us to testimony. Captain Elias Ward said, what price hides inside your charity? Liss Ether said, someone aboard is feeding your keys to Director Voss. Rian Cole said, that's a polite slander. The narrator felt the room tilt as Trust slid to one side. Liss Ether said, follow my vector or be written into the ledger as accomplices to silence. The narrator rode the click of keys as Mira and Nova sifted logs, and each line of time felt like a blade. Nova Reed said there's a phantom handoff in nav telemetry. Dr. Mira Salas said, inserted during the corridor run. Jace Arden said, who had access then. Captain Elias Ward said, everyone who saved our lives. Ryan Cole said, and anyone who wants them later. The ledger fragments displayed checksum scars like bruises. Liss Ether said, your betrayer thinks speed is innocence. Ryan Cole said, you don't even exist outside a mask. The narrator watched tension climb the ladder of voices. Jace Arden said, we test every console for spoofed keys. Captain Elias Ward said, we keep our tempers until the data speaks. The data spoke in a voice that pointed. The narrator held breath with the ship as accusation met denial, and the air tasted like static. Jace Arden said, your station wrote Voss a path. Ryan Cole said, my station saved your skin. Captain Elias Ward said, hands off the board and step back. Dr. Mira Salas said, intent can hide, signatures cannot. Rian Cole said, you all wanted a villain, so you built me. Nova Reed said, don't make this worse. An emergency shutter sighed as if choosing a side. The deck lurched when a power loop bloomed from navigation to comms and lit the bridge in hungry red. Rian Cole said, I'm done carrying your history lessons. The narrator watched him snap a tether cutter and run for the flight bay with a shard of the ledger pressed to his chest. The narrator traced the betrayal to the hangar where small craft slept like folded knives. Rian Cole said, open bay, priority escape. Director Adrian Voss said, bring me the shard and I bring you amnesty. Jace Arden said, that amnesty buys ash. Nova Reed said, I can stall the doors. Dr. Mira Salas said, Liss, if you are truly ally, prove it now. Liss Ether said, Vector injected, trust is a debt I will pay. Captain Elias Ward said, seal the bay and stand down. Ryan Cole said, you never meant me to be anything but expendable. The hangar lights died, and a narrow path of guidance beacons lit like stepping stones into a throat of dark. The narrator felt the choice tear. Ryan Cole said, tell your ledger a new name. He burned for the launch rail and vanished into silence. The narrator counted the seconds since Rian vanished and felt the ship expand with doubt like a bruise. Captain Elias Ward said, we track the launch signature and stay dark. Jace Arden said, Voss will promise him absolution and pay in chains. Dr. Mira Salas said, the ledger needs a living witness. Liss Ether said, follow my vector to a debris shrine. Nova Reed said the witness engine agrees. The Lumen slid along the spine of a shattered carrier, and shadows braided over the hull. The narrator sensed intention where physics should rule. Liss Ether said the dead congregate around their archive. Jace Arden said, then someone survived to remember. Captain Elias Ward said, if so, they choose whether we deserve truth. The narrator watched a faint beacon bloom like a heartbeat inside a coffin of steel. The narrator felt old air pour from the carrier as doors gave way and a hush settled like ritual. Nova Reed said, beacon source is a cryofield. Jace Arden said, stand by, medkit and questions. Dr. Mira Salas said, we approach as archivists, not saviors. Liss Ether said, one pod failed and left a scar. Captain Elias Ward said, stay tight and record. A figure staggered from shadows with eyes like burned glass and a voice filled with torn nights. Sarah Quinn said, "Do not wake the engines with lies." The name scratched the silence like a key. Jace Arden said, "We're here for truth and the ledger." Sarah Quinn said, "Truth murdered my ship and kept the bodies for change." The narrator knew a survivor when the past flinched at their breath. The narrator traced Sarah's story across shattered years and found a pulse under the rubble. Sarah Quinn said, "We were flagged as refugees and rerouted to processing." Dr. Mira Salas said, "Processing meant engines." Jace Arden said, "The ledger names the ports that fed the maw." Captain Elias Ward said, "Who signed the orders?" Sarah Quinn said, "A Precept Commodore who begged forgiveness too late." A pod hissed and yielded a man whose uniform was a ruin and whose eyes carried a funeral. Oren Hale said, "I signed them." Liz either said, "Tragic hero or practiced sinner." Oren Hale said, "Both." The narrator felt the room shrink until only choices fit. Jace Arden said, "Then speak for the dead you conscripted." Oren Hale said, "I will, or I will break on it." The narrator followed Oren's confession like a map etched in ash. Oren Hale said, "We were promised a victory without graves." Dr. Mira Salas said, "You built one engine to hold them all." Oren Hale said, "They called it redemption tithe." Sarah Quinn said, "They called us numbers." Jace Arden said, "Voss inherited this doctrine, not its shame." Liz Ether said, "He wears peace like armor to hide the debt." Captain Elias Ward said, "Why warn us now?" Oren Hale said, "Because the witness engine wakes what it remembers." The room vibrated as the ledger resonated with Sarah's breath and Oren's guilt, and the past answered like thunder under ice. The narrator felt the case assemble itself, heavy as a verdict. The narrator marked the moment the hunter found them by the way stars sharpened like teeth. Director Adrian Voss said, "Relinquish the ledger and your criminals." Captain Elias Ward said, "Your warrant ends at truth's door." Jace Arden said, "We present sworn witness under Concord law." Dr. Mira Salas said, "We are recording transmission and telemetry." Sarah Quinn said, "Say my name into your archive and hear it echo back." Oren Hale said, "I testify to crimes of command, including my own." Liz Ether said, "The witness engine requires a final key." The wreck field stirred, arranging itself like a cathedral nave. The narrator felt the dead take attendance. Jace Arden said, "Key accepted." Director Adrian Voss said, "Then accept judgment." The first salvo tore the dark, and the ledger began to sing. The narrator felt the ledger's song thread through shattered hulls as the first barrage faded. Captain Elias Ward said, "Damage report." Nova Reed said, "Shields at 40 and falling." Jace Arden said, "Vector to the witness engine." Dr. Mira Salas said, "Its pulse is stabilizing the debris corridor." Sarah Quinn said, "Voss cannot silence every ghost." Oren Hale said, "I will face him and pay what I owe." Liz Ether said, "Then we anchor the ledger to the engine core." Director Adrian Voss said, "Run, and history dies with you." The void quivered under their defiance. The narrator watched starlight bend as the wreck field shifted again, as if the dead themselves pushed them forward. The narrator tracked Voss's pursuit as debris folded into protective arcs around the witness engine. Jace Arden said, "Oren, your voice unlocks the core." Oren Hale said, "Let the record judge me." Sarah Quinn said, "And redeem the lost." Dr. Mira Salas said, "Nova, maintain data stream integrity." Nova Reed said, "Signal interference rising." Captain Elias Ward said, "Hold course on minimal burn." Liz Ether said, "Voss maneuvers for a flank strike." Director Adrian Voss said, "Truth belongs to victors, not cowards." The ledger pulsed brighter, and the narrator felt its hum echo inside bone and metal alike. The narrator measured silence before betrayal's echo. Director Adrian Voss said, "End transmission, or I scatter your atoms." Jace Arden said, "You've already scattered enough." Voss's corvette fired a harpoon missile that tore a wreck's spine apart. Nova Reed said, collision fragments incoming. Captain Elias Ward said, brace for debris impact. Liss Ether said, witness engine rerouting path vectors. Sarah Quinn said, Oren now. Oren Hale said, recording final testimony. The missile's wake illuminated the corridor like dawn on a graveyard. The narrator held the weight of the moment as shards of the past became shields for the present. The narrator followed the final synchronization as the ledger fused with the witness engine, light threading through every wreck. Jace Arden said, transfer complete. Dr. Mirasalis said, the galaxy will see the crimes tonight. Nova Reed said, engine output rising beyond safe levels. Sarah Quinn said, it's waking the graves. Oren Hale said, this is my penance. Captain Elias Ward said, prepare for jump on my mark. Liss Ether said, once the record releases, Voss can't bury it. Director Adrian Voss said, then I bury you instead. The narrator felt history tear free of its cage as starlight warped around them. The narrator felt the galaxy's breath as the witness engine erupted, broadcasting its truth through every relay. Director Adrian Voss said, no, this cannot stand. Jace Arden said, history stands without your consent. Dr. Mirasalis said, the Concord will see every name. Sarah Quinn said, the dead are heard. Oren Hale said, let my name be among them. Nova Reed said, transmission reached all sectors. Liss Ether said, then the ledger is immortal. Captain Elias Ward said, prepare jump, destiny waits. The wreck field flared like sunrise on iron bones. The narrator closed their eyes as the stars rewrote their map. The narrator felt the broadcast blaze across the sectors, while the corvette's guns stitched fire through the darkened duty, narrowed to a blade. Director Adrian Voss said, cut their tongue from the stars. Captain Elias Ward said, hold the corridor and brace. Jace Arden said, we anchor near the witness engine and draw his fire. Dr. Mirasalis said, evidence redundancies are live. Nova Reed said, multiple locks on our core. Sarah Quinn said, then make them earn each inch. Oren Hale said, I will speak from the bow if I must. Liss Ether said, a ghost craft approaches from the drift. The narrator tasted dread and recognition when a familiar transponder flared like a bruise. Rian Cole said, Lumen, I am coming home, but I am not alone. The void held its breath, and the crew did not. The narrator tracked the skiff's ragged arc as it veered between burning spars and bled sparks like a comet ashamed of its tail. Ryan Cole said, Voss seeded a kill switch in the ledger shard. Jace Arden said, did you trigger it? Rian Cole said, I jammed it and ran. Dr. Mirasala said, we can isolate the strand if you dock hot. Captain Elias Ward said, clear bay, 3, and prep magnet. Nova Reed said, guidance beacons live. Liss Ether said, Voss will target the docking collar. Director Adrian Voss said, return my property pilot. Sarah Quinn said, he is not property. Oren Hale said, neither are the dead. The narrator felt gravity return as choices found weight again. Jace Arden said, Ryan, trust us once. The narrator watched sparks fall like winter as the skiff slammed to a halt, and guilt met consequence without a shield. Ryan Cole said, take the shard and cut me out of it. Dr. Mira Salas said, hold still and breathe. Nova Reed said, kill switch signature found in his nav stack, Aoi. Jace Arden said, reroute it into a decoy packet. Liss Ether said, I can spoof Voss for 13 seconds. Captain Elias Ward said 13 will have to be salvation. Sarah Quinn said, if he runs you again, we anchor him to witness law. Oren Hale said, I will testify on open band. Director Adrian Voss said, confession is only noise against ordinance. The narrator counted down with the lights while the shard's venom slid from Ryan's systems like smoke, leaving a room. The narrator felt truth ignite as Orin's oath rose on an open frequency, and carved a road through jamming like a knife through old cloth. Orin Hale said, "Under charge of conscience, I name my orders and my shame." Sarah Quinn said, "Name the ports and the dead." Jace Arden said, "The record receives you." Dr. Mira Salas said, "Checksums verified." Nova Reed said, "Public relays are mirroring." Director Adrian Voss said, "Mute them." Liz Ether said, "Your mute is already archived." Captain Elias Ward said, "Hold formation for the final pass." Rian Cole said, "Give me a line to his flank." The narrator saw paths realign as loyalty found a target, and the debris corridor bent like a bow strung for justice. The narrator entered the eye of the storm where decisions harden into names, and names harden into verdicts. Director Adrian Voss said, "Peace requires obedience." Jace Arden said, "Peace requires witness." Rian Cole said, "I owe you a corridor." Captain Elias Ward said, "Make it count." Dr. Mira Salas said, "Rebound windows open now." Nova Reed said, "Telemetry green." Sarah Quinn said, "For the taken." Orin Hale said, "For the ledger." Liz Ether said, "Execute." Rian Cole burned his engine into Voss's shield vector and drew the fire like a bright lie that saved a truer word. The narrator watched the corvette yaw, exposing its throat. Captain Elias Ward said, "Break and live." Ryan Cole said, "Tell the record I returned." The Flash wrote his choice across the dark. The narrator listened to the universe gasp as Voss's corvette reeled, smoke curling like torn banners. Captain Elias Ward said, "Hold formation, no pursuit." Jace Arden said, "Rian's intercept opened the vector." Dr. Mira Salas said, "Telemetry confirms Voss's shields collapsing." Nova Reed said, "I can still hear his last transmission echoing." Sarah Quinn said, "His choice carved a path for the dead." Orin Hale said, "Let my oath travel with his." Liz Ether said, "We have a corridor out, but vengeance is circling." Director Adrian Voss said, "You'll carry infamy, not glory." The narrator felt the ledger hum like a heartbeat through every hull fragment. Jace Arden said, "Truth survives infamy." The narrator traced the engine wake as the Lumen threaded between skeletal wrecks, gravity wells whispering like ghosts. Dr. Mira Salas said, "We stabilize the witness engine before it implodes." Nova Reed said, "Residual energy spiking. She's alive." Sarah Quinn said, "Alive and vengeful." Orin Hale said, "Then let her vengeance speak truth, not destruction." Captain Elias Ward said, "Anchor thrusters and align relays." Jace Arden said, "Voss will regroup fast." Liz Ether said, "Then we finish before he recovers." The ledger's glyphs flickered across their faces like passing constellations. The narrator understood the galaxy's memory was reweaving itself in real time. The narrator felt the witness engine's light wrap the ship as glyphs synchronized into a final verse. Orin Hale said, "I free every name I condemned." Sarah Quinn said, "And I free you from silence." Dr. Mira Salas said, "Checksum complete. The ledger is permanent." Nova Reed said, "Transmission reaching Concord archives." Captain Elias Ward said, "Prepare for extraction burn." Liz Ether said, "Voss is falling back, but will rewrite his story." Jace Arden said, "History has already written it for him." The narrator marked the turning of an age as the debris field drifted apart like petals after bloom. Director Adrian Voss said, "This is not the end." The narrator recorded the Lumen's quiet run past broken fleets and felt destiny's shadow stretch ahead. Nova Reed said, "What happens to us now?" Dr. Mira Salas said, "We've rewritten the galaxy's memory." Captain Elias Ward said, "And place targets on our backs." Sarah Quinn said, "The dead will guard you." Orin Hale said, "And haunt me." Liz Ether said, "Voss will scheme anew, but seeds of change are planted." Jace Arden said, "We carry truth, not safety." The void outside glimmered like an audience of silent witnesses. The narrator let the hum of the engines become a hymn for the fallen and the living. The narrator framed the last image. A galaxy turned slightly on its axis by courage and cost. Captain Elias Ward said, "Set course for the Concord Council." Dr. Mira Salas said, "Let them face the ledger's weight." Nova Reed said, "Rian's name will echo there." Sarah Quinn said, "So will every soul he saved." Oren Hale said, "May their ghosts guide us." Lisether said, "Destiny's shadow will follow, but so will light." Jace Arden said, "Then we go forward, scarred but unbroken." The stars whispered, promises and warnings in equal measure. The narrator let silence close like a book, leaving the last page unwritten.